than double the actual growth over the last 10 years. Scarcity, for starters, is crucial.
City unit versus regional house. Are you better off with a smaller property in a prime location or a whole house in a regional town? This episode, we speak with Tim Watson, buyer's agent who's built his own $6 million portfolio to better understand the numbers of what could make the superior investment.
The data definitely stacks up. If you really want to build long-term wealth,
if you're about to buy an investment property in Australia and not sure what's going to have the best ROI, a city unit or a regional house, this episode could be an absolute game changer for you. This is the Pizza and Property Podcast. My name's Todd Sloan, and you're listening to my chat with Tim Watson.
Tim Watson, how are you, mate?
very good, Todd. Great to be here.
Mate, it's good to have you here. I think you're going to be putting an answer to a question that is asked by a lot of people, and that's, should I be buying a regional house or is a metro unit better? Essentially, it's like size versus location, I think, is the way a lot of people see this. But there's a lot more to it than just size versus location. But before we get into everything that you've put together, because you've got some good stuff in front of you right now, is there anything that you wanted to kind of add to this first or set the stage with?
Oh, look, I think that regional house versus unit, it's a dilemma many people face. What should I be doing?
Mm-hmm.
And look, I think in summary, I think some key takeaways are, if you really want to build long-term wealth, houses are your best option to go for. And we're going to cut into a little bit of the data that supports why that makes sense.
That's why I wanted to do this with you, because I know it wasn't going to be an opinion fest of this is all of my thoughts, my anecdotes.
Yep.
It can still be helpful, but it's like, let's actually cut to the numbers. So why don't we actually start with this? Because I think you've divided it up into, if I've got it right here, so average comps, then we're talking about scarcity, we're talking about yields, we're talking about value add potential. There's a whole bunch of different levels to this. Which one do you want to start with?
Well, I think let's start with average capital growth, because ultimately that's what people are looking for.
Mm-hmm.
When we're investing, we're trying to get the maximum growth we can. And equally, achieving that in the early years is really important to building and scaling the portfolio. So I think that's a good place to start.
100%. All right. What data do you have in front of you as far as average capital growth rates?
So look, it's really interesting. And this is data from the ABS, and it's looking back at the last 10 years. And I'm just going to have a look at some of the data that I've got on the laptop.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Sydney, for instance, versus regional New South Wales house, the last 10-year growth for Sydney units is 38%.
Okay, yep.
Now, if you compare that to regional New South Wales house, 92%.
Yeah, right.
So more than double the actual growth over the last 10 years. And that picture hasn't changed much when you go back to 20 years either.
Okay, so it's not like this is just cherry-picked over the last decade. Like, it's pretty much the same thing over 2 decades.
There is no doubt that if you have invested in a regional New South Wales house, you've far outperformed buying a Sydney unit.
And not, that's almost, what is that, double and a bit? Almost
Certainly
triple,
more
not quite?
It's more than double.
Yeah, that's insane. All right, well, what about the rest? Is Sydney and New South Wales just a standout for that? Or
well, no, that's the interesting thing. So I've got data for Sydney, for Melbourne, and also for Brisbane versus Queensland.
Why don't we go to Melbourne next? Because Melbourne is like the city of units. Like, there's a lot of them.
There are. And look, maybe not surprisingly, there isn't that much of a difference. If you look at Melbourne units, you're looking at 32% growth over the last 10 years compared to a regional Vic house, 85%. So again, more than double the growth.
I feel like we can almost end the episode here.
Have I convinced you yet, Todd?
Well, yeah, kind of. All right, what about Brizzy?
Yeah, so Brizzy, the final bit of data. And for this one, to be fair, it's not as dramatic. If you look at Brisbane units, it's 36%. A regional Queensland house is 46%.
That's not as dramatic. Okay.
Not as dramatic.
Why do you reckon that is?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm really not sure what drives that. But if anything, one of my key takeaways was, if you went back to and you're investing 10 years ago, you would much rather have been investing in a regional New South Wales house or a regional Vic house than you would in regional Queensland. And that might be because we obviously had a period where for Queensland generally there wasn't that dramatic growth compared to those other two states.
That actually makes sense, because we're also comparing Queensland's boom time of like COVID boom.
Sure.
But then we've also got Sydney and Melbourne, which had a lovely boom from 2014 to 2017, approximately.
Correct.
And they've enjoyed growth as well over like COVID. Yeah, okay. So we're kind of double stacking boom against a single stack boom.
Yep. Absolutely.
All right, that actually makes a bit of sense. What about the scarcity factor? Because average capital growth, I mean, you've knocked that out the park already.
Yep.
Talk to me about scarcity.
Okay, so look, we know scarcity, for starters, is crucial because when you're looking at the supply of units and houses, obviously that's a key driver of the actual price growth. The more units you have, naturally that dampens the actual price growth. Whereas if you compare that to a house situation where you're investing in the land, it's not as easy to build houses as obviously sticking up a block of units. So some of this might not surprise you. Again, if we look at Sydney units, the last 10-year change, there's been a growth of units in 72%. So it's gone from, and just to confirm how we're looking at this.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask.
So we're looking at for sale listings, March 2014 compared to March 2024.
Okay.
As an indicator of the number of the stock that's on the market.
Yep.
So 8,674 units back in March 2014 compared to just under 15,000 in 2024. So that's where the 72% comes from. So from a unit perspective, dramatically different from a Sydney house perspective, in that you're looking at just under 16,000 houses for sale back in 2014 and just under 18,000 for 2024. So you've got a 15% change. So the delta on that is obviously quite dramatic.
That's huge. Like, I'm going to be like frank. I went into this kind of going, I know I'd be buying a regional house. You and I have talked before. We've both got portfolios. I didn't actually think that this would be so big, though. I thought you'd be showing some data that's like, no, this is why it's like slightly the better choice, not like smashing it out of the park the better choice.
The numbers are crazy. And look, I have to say, it's not that different when you start moving around the state either. So Melbourne units, just over 11,000 10 years ago, just under 15,000 now. So it's not as dramatic as Sydney. That's a 31% increase.
Okay.
But in that same time period, houses, the actual stock on markets dropped 20%.
So houses have gone backwards, units have gone up.
Correct. So again, massive difference. Brizzy, funnily enough, units almost equal, the same number of listings of just over 5,400 back in 2014, almost an identical figure. It changes by, funnily enough, 7.
Yeah, right.
So
okay.
No change.
Yep, no change.
Brisbane houses, 21,000, just over 21,000.
In 2014?
In 2014, just under 13,000 in 2024.
Wow.
So, again,
that's huge.
It's a big change.
Okay, so we can see why there's so much price pressure that's being put on houses around the country. And whilst units have gone up, they haven't gone up with the same kind of madness that houses have.
No. And I think it comes back to that point that it's obviously so much easier for developers to build a block of units and dramatically change the number of units that are available with the market. You just don't have that ability with the houses, and that's certainly what the data points to.
So for someone that's listening now and going, okay, I get it, capital growth side, it's not really there. I'm convinced already, but yield. I want cash flow.
Yep.
Units have got much better yield.
Yep.
Let's address that.
So interestingly, okay, the last two that we've looked at, there's dramatic differences. Yield, there isn't. When you look at units, you're looking at about 4.16% is the average rental yield. Regional New South Wales, 4.39%.
So units 4.1, where was that?
So that's just generally Sydney units across
Sydney
the
units
board.
Across the board, yep.
If you look at Melbourne, units 4.18, regional Vic houses 4.37. And if you look at Brisbane, 5.14 for units, 5.12 for a regional Queensland house. I think one of the key takeaways is we're talking about gross yield here. And so you've got to consider all the costs that go into owning a unit. And look, I personally experienced this. I made the mistake of buying a unit in 2016 up in the Gold Coast. And what I hadn't realised prior to making that investment was the dramatic impact things like strata can have on your ability with taking away a net yield. So after all your costs, what are you left with? For me, that's one of the key takeaways here is even though the gross yields look pretty similar, your net yields actually, the strata can be a bit of a killer.
And just for anyone that's a little bit newer to property investing, going gross yield, net yield, what's the difference? Gross yield is essentially just the yield before any expenses are taken out. Net yield is your yield, which is your return after all of the expenses come out. So after your council rates, your insurance, all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
But not including your mortgage repayments, because depending on your LVR, that is a variable. Depending on your interest rate, that is a variable. But the fixed cost are things like strata, are things like council rates.
Correct.
So as far as the difference there, do you have any sort of data, or you've got a smile on your face?
There's just one example that I'd love to pull out, and there's many examples that are similar to this. But looking back, found a unit in Elizabeth Bay in Sydney.
Yeah. Where
the strata alone was $4,000 a quarter.
Were you talking about a penthouse though?
To be honest, I don't think it was a penthouse. It's a studio apartment. 790K, so it can't be. Yeah, no, can't be that
that's
dramatic.
Not a penthouse. If it is, I'll buy that right now.
After
everything you've said about units,
that's right. But to have a quarterly strata of 4K,
that's
nuts. It takes your gross yield. So anyone who doesn't really understand or hasn't had the experience of buying a unit might look at that and think 4.1%. You know what? That's okay.
Yep.
2.1% just after you take into account the strata, let alone any of the other costs that might be involved. So it can be dramatic.
And whilst that is that's a huge comparison, even if let's even say that it was more like $1,500 a quarter, which is pretty standard for a lot of units.
Absolutely.
Or even 2,000, we're still talking about losing an entire percent at least off of your net versus gross yield.
Absolutely. Yeah. And look, I'm sure many of your listeners will have heard these horror stories of where units aren't built as we would expect.
Oh, you remember Mascot Tower?
Correct. Yeah. Absolutely. And so, equally, there are some cases where completely out of the blue, I came across one scenario where a 2.4 million special levy was required across the 50 units. Now, you can only imagine what that then does to, if strata payments weren't bad enough, imagine trying to pay that on top as well.
And just for anyone scratching their head thinking, what's a special levy? So essentially a special levy is a power that the Strata Corporation has to basically just give a bill to everyone that owns the property, or like that owns a piece of the property, I should say. And it's like, here's a maintenance bill. This needs to be done. It's not like, hey, we wanted to redo the barbecues. Normally it's something like the lift shaft needs to be replaced. The roof needs to be, like, it's a serious thing. You don't have a choice. You can't opt out of that. That is something that, here's the bill, you're paying it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, and finally, value add potential. For anyone that's still maybe, I don't know, umming and ahhing, I don't know why, but let's say they are. Value add potential is something that is going to have I'm assuming, quite a drastic difference as well. Whilst if we're comparing new units, there's pretty much none.
Yep.
But you can still get some of the older, like yellow brick walk-ups where there is some value add potential.
Yep.
But can you open up a little bit more about what options, I guess, you've got available as an investor putting these two side by side?
With regards to units, at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do. You can obviously repaint the place, you can make cosmetic changes, but from a structural point, your hands are tied as to what you can do.
And it's not even just structural. I still remember selling, when I was an agent, it wasn't a penthouse, but pretty much at the top. And it was section 10.4.2. I remember this very correctly, very, very, very vividly, I should say. The person that bought it wanted to make a polished concrete floor. Right. But 10.4.2 specified that there needed to be an acoustic membrane between the concrete and the actual like footings of where people basically can walk. And this was to stop any kind of acoustic travel between apartments. Essentially, they end up getting around it, which I won't get into in this episode. But even just ripping up the tiles and polishing the concrete, that was a nightmare. The entire sale almost fell through because polished concrete was super important to this buyer.
Yep.
But it's like, that wasn't even structural. That was essentially changing the flooring.
Yeah. So
your options are, much more limited.
Correct. Now, if you compare that to owning a house, where you obviously own the land the house is built on, you've got far more ability to make changes that you want to do, whether it be still cosmetic, painting the property, changing the colour of the wall outside, whatever you want to do, that's within your control. Now, obviously, if you want to go beyond that and you've got the land size and you want to build a granny flat, as long as it's within the council planning regulations, you've still got the ability to do that as well. So you can considerably add value or add income in through adding another property, as long as it fits within the local planning guidelines.
Which are going to be a lot looser than having strata on top of local planning guidelines.
Correct. So, and for I think for investors out there, there's no doubt cash flow is important, and sometimes the ability to generate a second income by granny flat build or other ways that you might be able to achieve that, it's important.
Well, I feel like stepping back for 2 secs onto the yield aspect of it, I feel like the reason a lot of people might go, no, but units yield higher is because they're not comparing to a regional house, they're comparing to a metro house.
Yep.
In that case, that'd be a very true statement if that's what you were looking at. But looking at all of this data, to me, it's a slam dunk. So I guess I wanted to wrap this up with, why do you think people still do buy them? Because we've just made this episode. I don't think we've killed unit sales for the entire country. There are still going to be thousands of developers out there selling them.
Of course.
I ask this question because I suppose it's interesting to get into the mind of what is it that you still think is appealing?
So I think fundamentally people want to live in certain locations. Take Sydney. If you want to live in the Sydney market, the reality is because of price changes over time recently, most people are only going to be able to afford a unit. And so if it's somewhere that they actually want to live themselves, it's the only option to them. I think that's one of the key drivers. That's why you will still see unit sales. It's down to the fact that from an affordability factor, obviously units are much, much cheaper than if you were buying in, say, a Sydney house as well.
So the key driver essentially comes down to lack of choice.
Lack of choice, lack of funding that would be available. Now, if you're an investor, that's quite a different situation because you can move your money anywhere. If you want to buy out in the region and you're not worried about going and seeing the place regularly, it opens up a whole different market for you. And I think the key point that we wanted to get across here is that if you've got that choice of buying a unit within the city compared to considering a regional house, the data definitely stacks up from a scarcity factor. There's no doubt. And, usually from a growth perspective, the data shows in the last 10 years, you would have done much better with regards to your investment.
Yeah, like almost 3 times better in some cases.
That's right.
Mate, Tim Watson from InvestorKit, thank you so much for jumping on the show. I'm sure you have opened a lot of eyes today, mate. Really appreciate your time.
Pleasure to be on, Todd.